Hello and good evening, everyone. I hope all Americans here had a very good Turkey Day. I did not eat turkey today because I'm British, obviously. But I had a good day regardless. I spent it mostly chilling. And for now, I am, because it's freezing, wrapped up in a blanket with a hot water bottle. It's not literally freezing, but it's pretty cold for me. Ugh, I know it gets much, much colder in America, but my house has dropped down to like 14 degrees because I don't have the heating on until late December, so I'm quite cold. But anyway, yeah, so tonight we're continuing Red Dwarf, and I've been excited to do so because I love Red Dwarf, as I say every single time I start the stream. But I hope everyone's good today. I hope everyone's happy and had a good time with family or avoided family, depending on your circumstances. But either way, I hope it's been lovely and peaceful, or at least delicious. Hiya, Druid. I hope you've had a good day anyway, somehow. Or I hope you've got enough sleep today. My hands are warming up. Yay. Okay. Not like I need them for much other than holding a book, but never mind. You okay? Okay, so last we left off, Rimmer, one Arnold Judas Rimmer, had found that his, all of them being currently trapped in the virtual reality game Better Than Life, Rimmer's psyche has basically corrupted the game to the point that he has become stuck in the bodysuit of a woman. And his own body has been stolen by a mass murderer. And so he has managed to escape and find Lister, who is living in Bedford Falls from the It's a Wonderful Life movie, and has ruined that as well by destroying the whole town, accidentally. But we're flashbacking now to Rimmer's early experiences as Trixie LaBouche, who has been made to go street walking on behalf of the two serial killers that she's with. But first, and I'm okay, thank you. I'm cold, but otherwise okay. But first, I wanted to do the intro. So, without further ado, we are now going to play the theme, the intro theme. So, here we go. And a 1, and a 2, and a 3. And that is, for anyone unaware, the intro theme to Series 3 onwards. And it's one of my favourites. It is a bop. It's a very good song. It's one of my favourite TV show themes of all time. Just going to move the table a bit. Anyway, and we've got an intro song for an outro song as well to do later. So, anyway, Chapter 15. Excuse the gurgling of my hot water bottle. Trixie LaBouche, aka Arnold J. Rimmer, strode down the main street of the red light district, with Tonto following 4 or 5 paces behind. Rimmer didn't know whether his stockings were too small or whether he'd just put them on wrong, but both his legs felt like they were spring-loaded. The 8-inch heels on his stilettos didn't help much either. He felt like he was leaning out of the door of an aircraft at 2,000 feet. The combination of stockings and stilettos forced him to adopt a rather unnatural gait, like a speeded-up goose step, as if his legs were constantly trying to escape him. Also, he discovered, he needed at least 4 seconds' notice to stop. He hurried along, trying to tug down his absurdly short black rubber skirt so that it at least covered the red nylon garter that was cutting off the circulation of his right leg, and offered some small protection against the sharp night air that whistled cruelly through his open crotch panties. He had to escape. He had to. He knew now his psyche was punishing him. And yes, he deserved to be punished. But he'd learned his lesson. Enough was enough. But did his psyche know that? Just how far was it prepared to go? Tonto whistled, and 4 paces later, Rimmer stopped. Tonto went over and started talking to an Armenian sailor, leaning in a shop doorway, chewing his way through a bag full of garlic cloves. Now was the time. He had to get out. He had to get out of Better Than Life. What was it Crichton had told him? Imagine an exit gate, and once you pass through it, you're back to reality. Tonto and the sailor walked over to join him. The Armenian leered, showing 3 silver teeth, and looked Trixie LaBouche's body up and down. "Nice piece of ass," he said. "Okay, $3. "Nice piece of what?" smiled Rimmer politely. "Nice piece of little chicken ass," grinned the Armenian. "Can't wait to get my teeth into it." "Well, while you're waiting," Rimmer grinned back, "why don't you get your teeth stuck into this?" He slammed the corner of his shoulder bag into the Armenian's leer and brought his right knee up between the sailor's legs. As the Armenian concertinade neatly to the floor, Rimmer swiveled round and imagined the exit gate. The pink neon archway materialised across the street, and he ran towards it, Tonto in pursuit. Unencumbered by stilettos, Tonto was naturally faster, but surprise had given Rimmer a 10-feet start, and he reached the exit a good yard or so ahead of the furious, psychopathic hippie. Rimmer dived through the exit gate, but hit something hard and unyielding and bounced back out again. He tried a second time. Same result. Tonto grabbed Trixie's peroxide hair and hauled Rimmer up to face level. "Don't get cute, sweetie." "Don't move, gentlemen!" Tonto's eyes clicked right. The police officer crouched behind a parked car, his long-stemmed gun trained on Tonto. "The party's over, gentlemen." "Hey," said Tonto with a demi-smile. "The party ain't over till there's only Cinzano left to drink." "Huh?" Tonto pushed Rimmer aside and went for the gun in his waistband. He never made it. 5 bullets thudded into his chest and he slithered down a car. Then he said the classic final line from Young, Bad and Dangerous to Know, from which Tonto had been created. "Life is like a joss stick." Blood gurgled from the corner of his mouth. "It stinks, and then it's over." On reflection, Rimmer thought as he scurried down the street, maybe it wasn't such a classic line after all. He doubled back to the hotel. The exit hadn't worked. Why? There could only be one answer. They'd all joined the game together. The headsets were interconnected. It was a shared scenario. They all had to leave together. Jimmy Jitterman, in Rimmer's body, stood on the steps of the Hotel Paradiso, engaged in a pitched battle to the death with 15 officers of the Special Weapons and Tactics Unit. He was taking on an entire SWAT team, single-handedly, in Rimmer's body. 300 bullets Gouda-cheesed Jimmy Jitterman out of existence, and a second volley completely obliterated Rimmer's old body. Rimmer, in Trixie LaBouche's body, continued running. There was only one place to go now. Bedford Falls. "Well," said Trixie LaBouche, wiping the blue disinfectant from her face, "you've taken it a hell of a lot better than I expected." "You're a groinhead, Rimmer." Lister sat the toilet down again, on the floor, and sighed. After a while, he spoke again. "So how did you get in the Juggernaut?" "I found it in the car park. It was the only one with the keys in it." Rimmer tilted Trixie LaBouche's head towards the floor. "Look, I'm sorry about the mess I caused, and..." His voice tailed off. Lister said nothing. "It was impossible to control the damned thing. Have you ever tried driving a 12-wheeled Juggernaut in 8-inch heeled stilettos? Why didn't you take them off? I couldn't reach the pedals. I'm only 5'2" now." "You're a groinhead, Rimmer. That's what you are. You're a total..." Lister shook his head. Not content with destroying your own fantasy, you've come here and destroy mine. What is wrong with your mind? It is totally diseased. I know, I can't help myself. My mind's got it in for me. We've got to get out of here. You mean you've got to get out of here? I'm putting up your bail. Lister hammered on the cell door and called for Bert the cop. Bert the cop sat at the old wooden desk and finished counting out the $10 bills that represented Lister's life savings. Sign here, he said curtly and slid a release form across the desk. Your life savings, he tutted. I sure hope she's worth it. Believe me, Bert, said Lister. She isn't. Out on the main street, it was still mayhem. 2 fire engines were fighting a losing battle to save the orphanage. Dozens of people ran up and down, carrying water in anything they could find and hurling it over the small fires that still pocked the main street. Families camped out under homemade tents made of blankets, while the injured were carefully stretchered into the back of farm vehicles and ferried to the county hospital more than 60 miles away. Don't get too down, said Rimmer, patting Lister tenderly on the shoulder. None of this really exists. You must have a hell of an appetite for Destrol fluid, Rimmer. Here. Lister waved his arm at the row of parked cars. Pick one of these and drive it away. No one will mind. Just get the smeg out of here. You don't understand. You've got to come with me. You've got to help me find Kat and Crichton. We've all got to leave the game together. I'm not leaving Bedford Falls. But it's not real. So? What have I got in reality? I'm the last human being alive, 3 million years out in deep space without a prayer of ever getting back to Earth. Everything I want is here. He was going to say my wife, but he checked himself. But the kids were gone too. His wife, his kids, his home, his little shop. Rimmer's single visit to Bedford Falls had laid waste to the whole of his fantasy. Don't you see? There's nothing to keep you here now. My mind destroyed it all, and if we don't get out of the game and back to reality, there's no telling what my psyche will do to us. I'm gonna stay. I can start again. Get Chrissy back, and the boys. It'll be alright. Rimmer shook his peroxide blonde head and pulled the trench coat he'd borrowed from Lister around his shivering form. You don't understand, do you? A huge triple tanker air braked to a halt beside them. The driver leaned out of the window and spat a lump of chewing tobacco spittle on the floor. Hey lady, he addressed Rimmer. Can you tell me where the Bedford Falls nuclear waste depot is? Lister walked over to the cab. Bedford Falls doesn't have a nuclear waste depot? Sure it does, the driver nodded. Opens tomorrow. Supposed to be somewhere near the new town sewage plant on, let me see. He consulted a clipboard. Sycamore Avenue. Sorry, said Rimmer quietly. There is no sewage plant on Sycamore Avenue? Lister insisted. Sure there is. The driver pointed into the murky, smoke-laden sky. You could see the stacks. Lister looked. All around Bedford Falls were huge, obscene configurations of industrial chimneys, belching thick black clouds into the night air. Look. The driver spat another brown plume onto the street. If you can just direct me as far as the prison, I'll find my way from there. What prison? You mean the jailhouse? No, the new prison. The new open prison. The one they've just opened for the rehabilitation of psychopathic serial killers. Lister looked at Rimmer, who just shrugged hopelessly. They walked across the street and headed for the line of parked cars. As they passed the rubble that had been his home, Lister spotted something. He stooped, tossed aside a couple of bricks and picked up a blue sailing yacht, which still bore the price tag, $2.25. He smoothed down the sails and clutched it to his chest. Come on, he said finally. Let's get out of here. They climbed into one of the cars, an Oldsmobile, Rimmer in the driving seat, Lister beside him. Rimmer started up the engine. Hang on, said Lister. Might be an idea if I drive. They swapped places. As Rimmer slid into the passenger seat, there was a crunch of broken wood. He arched his back and fished out a squashed yacht. What the hell's this? He said, and tossed it out the window. Lister wiggled the gear lever into first, and the Oldsmobile bumbled down the devastated main street and up the hill out Bedford Falls. As they reached the hill's crest, Lister stopped the car and craned around. He'd been in better than life now for nearly 2 years, and he had never thought he'd leave. Bedford Falls was his own personal nirvana. His psyche had created a town and community based on his all-time favourite movie, Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life, and this was where he wanted to spend the rest of his days. He'd been aware, though he'd never thought about it too much, that BTL would eventually kill him. His body out there in reality would gradually waste away and die, but it was a deal he'd been prepared to accept. Here in the game, he'd had everything he desired. A community full of good people, his kids, his little shop. Best of all, he was married to Christine Kachansky. Out there in reality, he had none of this, nor any chance of ever getting it. And worse still, in reality, Christine Kachansky was dead. Christine Kachansky had been the one and only good thing that had happened to Lister since he'd signed up with Red Dwarf. In fact, she'd been the only good thing to happen to him since that drunken night on his 24th birthday celebration, which ended with him coming into a burger bar on Mimas wearing only a pair of yellow fishing waders and a lady's pink crimpline hat. Ever since that night, his life had been a constant struggle to get back home to Earth. Frankly, he hadn't had much success. He'd gone from Earth to Mimas, and from there to some unknown location in the middle of deep space. And now, here he was, in the wrong plane of the wrong dimension of reality. Well, he'd had enough. He'd quit. BTL was where he was staying. This was where he wanted to be, because it was the only place he could be with Christine Kachansky. Now it was over. He had to go. He stared down at the ruined town, then turned back and started to release the handbrake as 5 jet fighters from the new Bedford Falls Air Force Base screamed in formation above him. "Thanks a lot, pal," he said to Rimmer. "Thanks a lot." Chapter 17. The cat curled up happily on his dogskin chased lounge, flicking idly through the TV channels with his remote control. Because of his notoriously short boredom threshold, most cat programs lasted less than 2 minutes. The advert breaks in between were a short sequence of flash frame blips. He flicked on Channel 2. It was a TV phone-in where cats with sexual problems called in, and a panel of experts laughed at them. "Line 7 now. What's your problem, buddy?" "I met this female and, for some reason, I still don't understand why, but for some reason, I felt like hanging around after we had sex." "You felt like what?" The panel screamed and slapped their hands on the desk. The cat snorted. "This guy is sick!" and flicked channels. He joined the middle of a cookery show, which was demonstrating 101 different ways of preparing hairballs. He flicked again and found a fashion show which had been recorded the night before and was consequently massively outmodded. This being the middle of the following afternoon. Next was some stupid love story, with the same plot as all other cat love stories. Boy meets girl, boy leaves girl, boy gets another girl. The cat shook his head. Romantic slush. Flick. Mouse tennis. Flick. At last, something interesting. MTV, the 24-hour mirror channel. The cat gazed lovingly at his reflected image, while smoochy music piped softly through the speakers. The program was totally ruined less than 3 hours later when a 30-millisecond advert break spoiled his concentration, and he flicked off the set in disgust. He slipped the gold fob watch out of his waistcoat, flicked open the cover, and stared at the dial. The cat had replaced the conventional numbers with a series of symbols, which stood for food, sex, snooze, light snooze, heavy snooze, major sleep, self-adoration hour, preening, and bath time. Right now it was 20 past sex, or, to put it another way, quarter to food. He snapped the watch closed and tugged the bell pull by his side. Then, instead of 10 half-naked oiled Valkyries charging through with silver platters, piled high with every kind of fish imaginable, ready to tend to his smallest whim, absolutely nothing happened. He jerked the bell pull once more, and again, absolutely nothing happened. Slightly panicked, the cat consulted his watch again. This was serious. His whole schedule was getting messed up. He was less than 20 minutes away from his 7th major snooze of the day, and he still had to cram in sex and lunch. Where were the Valkyries? He went over to the wall, opened the dumbwaiter hatch, climbed in, and shimmied down the rope to the kitchens. Crichton, as usual, was in the kitchens mopping the cat's huge black and white checked stone floor. "I've nearly finished," said Crichton to the cat as he climbed out of the hatch. "Just a few more minutes and then we really must get back to reality. Oh, look at this!" He orgasmed. "A custard stain, and it goes right across the length of the floor." "Where are the Valkyries?" "They formed the Valkyrie Sex Slave Liberation Movement and left for the mainland. You just missed them." "They what?" "Yes, they were sick and tired of bowing to your every whim and desire." The cat slumped into a carved oak chair. "Why?" he said, genuinely mystified. "Well, if you'll pardon my directness, it's fairly obvious, isn't it?" "It is?" "Of course it is." The cat wrinkled his nose. "What's that smell?" He stood up and sniffed around. "It's like bad cheese. What is it?" He flung open a leaded window and looked down. "The moat's curdled. It's never done that before." "Don't worry," said Crichton. "I'll clean it all out and put in some fresh milk just as soon as I've finished." He stared down at the broken mop handle in his hand. "Well, that's curious." Cat leaned back in from the window. "What's that out there?" Crichton waddled over with his broken mop head and his suddenly leaking bucket and joined him. "That's a volcano," said Crichton. "Never noticed that before," said the cat. "And what's that funny red smoky bubbly stuff coming out the top?" "Magma," said Crichton chirpily, pleased he knew the answer to the question. "Also known as molten lava." "Is it dangerous?" "Only if it's heading this way." "It is heading this way." "Da, da, 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 da," said Crichton, his circuits locked in panic mode. "I don't get it." The cat scuffed his spattered boot against the wrought iron stove. "What's going on here?" "Perhaps she can explain that," said Lister. The cat and Crichton turned to see Lister standing under the expansive arch of the kitchen's doors, with a peroxide blonde in fishnet stockings, 8-inch stilettos, and a huge army trench coat. "He's right," she said. "It's my fault, all of it." The castle rocked as the volcano's plug was blasted into the stratosphere, blackening the sky and showering the cat's estate with volcanic ash and flaming boulders. The cat was the only one who kept his footing. "What are we gonna do?" "We're gonna do what we should have done a long time ago," said Lister, climbing to his feet. "We're getting out of here. We're going back to reality." Chapter 18. The LCD display melted from 600 hours to 700 hours, and a millisecond before the alarm was set to bray into life, Lister's arm stretched out from under the regulation-issue duvet and clicked it off with a satisfying clip. His body was spiced inside with that red-letter-day feeling, like something wonderful had happened, but his half-awake mind hadn't quite remembered it. He right-angled his body, swiveled around, slid his feet into the soft warmth of his slippers, and shuffled over to the viewport window. He gazed out into the black felt of space. Diamonds of light glimmered and gleamed a welcome home. "I'm back," he thought. "Back on Red Dwarf. Back in reality." A contented smile spread itself into a yawn on his face. He turned and opened the sleeping quarters fridge. He pulled out a jug of freshly squeezed orange juice and a saran-wrapped half grapefruit. He flipped the percolator to espresso, went through to the shower cubicle as the coffee machine gurgled its good morning. "We've done it. We've beaten it. We're out." He spun the taps and water Niagara'd onto the pine-scented rubber shower mat. He pushed his hand into the curtain of water. Warm and perfect. Not hot, not cold, just perfect. It was good to be alive. He scrubbed himself first date clean, grabbed a thick white towel and dabbed himself dry. He padded back to the coffee machine and sluiced down another quite superb cup of espresso. He poured himself another. The second cup tasted even better than the first. And that was when Lister started to think. The second cup tasted better than the first. The second cup never tasted better than the first. He clicked open the fridge door. It looked like an advert for refrigerators. It was packed with fresh vegetables and crisp salads. There were 8 kinds of cheese, various slices of lean cooked meat, a whole salmon, a rack of lamb tipped with little paper chef's hats, and a bottle of champagne on chill. Was this really his fridge? Where was the curdling milk struggling out of the top of its carton? Where was the strange smell that sent his stomach into a loop-de-loop and was impossible to track down? Where was his spare pair of trainers? He usually kept them in the ice compartment to cool down. There was nothing in the ice compartment except for a varied selection of delicious-sounding ice creams, and, for the first time in history, some ice. Ice? What was ice doing in the ice-making compartment of Lister's fridge? And where was that indefinable green mush in the salad tray? The one that resulted from decaying vegetables blending together so it was impossible to tell where the lettuces ended and the cabbages began. No, this was a fridge that belonged in a mail-order catalogue. This was the fridge that the Great Gatsby flung open when Daisy came calling. There was something wrong. What was wrong was there was nothing wrong. He looked down at his ship regulation issue bath towel. Space Corps towels were famous for 2 features. Firstly, they were as thin as damp poppadoms and about half as absorbent. And secondly, they were too short to wrap around the waist. They always left a Balinese dancing girl gap down the side of one leg. Not this one. This was as thick as a rug and lapped his waist twice. Maybe he got thinner. Maybe. Lister caromed over to the bread bin and flipped the lid. Groaned. There was bread in it, freshly baked. White, brown, wholemeal, multigrain, baps, rolls. He hauled out a farmhouse loaf, carved a slice and slammed it onto the grill. He paced up and down impatiently, waiting for the bread to toast. His mind rewound to the night before. The 4 of them passing through the exit gate and emerging in the cargo hold, Rimmer changing en route from Trixie LaBouche's body back to his own hologrammatic form. Their conversation with Holly. The pauseless journey back up to the sleeping quarters. The shuttle bus, the ship metro, the express lift up 2,050 floors. They hadn't had to wait for any of them. He looked under the grill. The bread was ready. Feverishly he buttered it and then spread a thick layer of chunky lime marmalade over its evenly browned surface. He held the toast in his hand, parallel with his chin, 5 feet from the floor, and dropped it. It spun end over end and landed. He looked down. It was marmalade up. He tried it again. Marmalade up. And again, and again. 20 times it landed marmalade up. Lister rifled through the sleeping quarters. Nothing was right. The half-full sauce bottle had no congealed brown rivulets running from neck to label. The remote control for the vid screen wasn't missing, and, even more damningly, the batteries hadn't been taken out and used for something else. Hey, anyone else used to do that for their Game Boy? Another test. He microwaved a roast beef and Yorkshire pudding frozen dinner. It tasted like roast beef and Yorkshire pudding. That wasn't possible. A microwave dinner that tasted better than its cardboard container. He opened the locker and glanced at his collection of videos. They were all standing in neat ranks, side by side, all boxed and labelled in his own hand. And worse, he found at least 38 he'd recorded and actually wanted to watch. This wasn't right. This wasn't normal. He was frying his 23rd egg without breaking a single yolk when Crichton bustled in. "It's incredible! The most marvellous thing has happened. I was mopping the floor, you know, the really dirty one on the stasis corridor? The one with the really wonderful stains? Then, guess what? I looked in the suspended animation booths, and not all the crew got wiped out in the accident. 3 survived." "Let me guess," said Lister. "Rimmer, Peterson, and Christine Kachansky?" "Yes!" Crichton clapped his hands in delight. "How did you know?" "We're still in the game, Crichton. This isn't reality." Rimmer skidded in through the sleeping quarters hatchway. "Guess what?" he beamed. "Something incredible's just happened." "This isn't reality," said Lister. The cat's smile entered the room, followed by the cat himself. "Hey, hey, hey! You're not going to believe what I'm about to tell you." We're still in better than life, said a crestfallen Rimmer. The cat's eyebrows met in a head-on collision over the bridge of his nose. Huh? Well done, said a voice. They all turned to see a small figure materialise in the corner of the quarters. It was a boy, 14 years old, with spiked, greasy hair, wearing over-large glasses, a purple anorak, and a wispy pubescent moustache. My name is Dennis McBean, the 3D recording... My name is Dennis McBean, the 3D recording continued. I am the game designer. You've negotiated the final obstacle in the most addictive computer game ever devised. You have earned a replay. No thanks, Acne Face, said the cat. The figure blipped off and the sleeping quarters slowly began to fade away. Suddenly, they were standing in a green grid matrix, which tapered off into an infinite blackness. A light appeared, and they walked towards it. As they approached the opening, huge letters whooshed under their feet. A gigantic R, then an E, then a V followed by an O. Then above their heads flew another set of letters, an E, an M, an A, finally a G. Finally, they'd made it. They staggered into the light and back out into reality. And that was the end of the first part of the second book. I'm not actually sure how many parts there are in each book, but at least they're out of Better Than Life now. Part 2. She Rides. Chapter 1. Slowly, very slowly, Lister's eyes adjusted to the gloom. It was dark. A small, dim emergency bulb was the room's only light source. Gradually, he made out the silhouettes of the others, half sitting, half crumpled in an irregular semicircle. He reached up and felt the headband through the matted mess of his hair, then gingerly eased the slurping electrodes out of his skull. Shivering, he watched as the others also wrenched themselves free and hurled their headbands into the middle of the semicircle. There were no conversations, no eye contact. Someone started coughing. Lister knew it was the cat without looking. He didn't want to look, but he couldn't help himself. His eyes darted to the right. He looked away again quickly. The cat was barely recognisable. His eyes seemed far too big for his face, as if his skull had shrunk. Flesh hung loosely from his gaunt, jutting bones. Lister studied his own trembling arms. Thin. His skin was like paper. He tried to get up. He wanted to stamp on the headsets to crush them, but he collapsed pathetically back on the floor. Then he rolled on his back and couldn't get up. He was as weak as a day-old giraffe. Crichton and Rimmer were fine, at least physically. Mechanoids and holograms don't suffer from muscle wastage. They got to their feet. Crichton spoke. I'll get a couple of... He didn't finish. He didn't want to say stretchers. He didn't want to say, we'd better get them to the medical unit as quickly as possible because they look like hell. Rimmer understood and nodded. Crichton ducked through the hatchway and into the corridor outside. The ship appeared to be on emergency power, which made no sense to Crichton. It made even less sense that everything was in such disarray. Congealed food which had spouted out of a faulty dispensing machine lay rotting on the floor. Water dripped in rusty pools through the metal-slatted ceiling from the corridor above. Thousands of wall circuits were burnt out, black and dead. All the screens which usually carried Holly's image were blank and lifeless. It was like a Sunday afternoon on the Mary Celeste. Crichton spent a good 20 minutes looking for some scutters. He finally tracked down a small group of them in the maintenance depot playing cards. What on earth do you think you're doing? Crichton clucked. Everything's absolutely filthy. Nothing's working. He clapped his hands. Come along. The 4 scutters pivoted their clawheads round to see who it was and went back to playing 5-card stud for nuts and bolts. Excuse me? Crichton waddled up to the table. If you want to go to Silicon Heaven, then I suggest you start obeying orders. Fairly smartly. The scutter's motors revved up and down in electronic sniggers. They didn't believe in Silicon Heaven. They were such basic work droids, the manufacturer hadn't considered it cost-effective to fit them with belief chips. As far as they were concerned, the only loony droids believed in Silicon Heaven. Whacked-out crazies like Crichton. Their own point of view was that the universe was totally meaningless, unjust and pointless, and the only single thing of any substance or beauty in the whole of creation was the double-threaded wingnut, which was easy to screw on or off, even in the most inaccessible of places. They were basically existentialists with a penchant for certain metal bonding device. "Now," said Crichton, flapping his palms against his thighs, "get 2 stretchers and follow me." Reluctantly, the scutters threw in their cards and grumbled after Crichton on their motorised bases. When Crichton returned with 4 scutters pushing 2 stretchers, Rimmer was standing in the corridor. "Listen," he said. "Hear anything?" Crichton tilted his head and set his ear microphones to maximum. "Hear it?" said Rimmer. Crichton couldn't hear anything apart from an overweight asthmatic beetle 3 floors below who was trying to climb up a wall. For simplicity's sake, he said, "I can't hear anything." Rimmer's head jabbed forward. "Neither can I," he said and smiled enigmatically. It was a tricky moment for Crichton. He had 2 sick humanoids to look after, 4 rebellious scutters, and now, it appeared, he had to contend with an insane hologram. "No, don't you get it?" said Rimmer. "Get what?" said Crichton uncertainly. "We can't hear anything." "Yes?" "The engines are dead. The ship is not moving." Chapter 2. Oh yes, in the last part of the book, Holly, the ship's senile computer, had undergone a dangerous procedure in order to shorten his lifespan, his working lifespan, in order to bolster his intelligence back to its usual levels. There was a miscalculation. He more than doubled his original lifespan, but reduced his operating time down to 3 minutes. So he's now switched everything off. Crichton wheeled Lister and the cat into the medical unit's recovery bay. He removed the ragged, stinking clothes, bathed them carefully, and gave them vitamin boosts. Then he connected the 2 patients up to the biofeedback computer and gently slipped them into the medisuits. Once their medisuits were fully inflated, Crichton hung them up on their 4 support poles, so Lister and Cat hung face up, immobile, and engaged the suit's power units. All the while he chatted lightly about nothing in particular, carefully avoiding any mention of the dead engines. When they were sleeping peacefully, he left to join Rimmer in the drive room. "I've been out all over the drive deck, everywhere. All Holly's screens are out. He won't respond." Crichton shuffled over to the bank of monitors and punched the keys for a status report. Grudgingly, the machine on emergency power finally chundered out a printout. "He's switched himself off," said Crichton. "Look!" Rimmer glanced at the incomprehensible gobbledygook of the symbols. "Ah," he said as if he understood them. "He's switched himself off." "And here," Crichton flicked the report with his finger. "For some reason, there was a massive power surge just 7 minutes before he went offline." Rimmer peered over Crichton's shoulder and hoped he was looking at the right section of gibberish which revealed this particular piece of information. "That's what it says," he confirmed. "There's no denying it." Crichton was very impressed. Very few non-mechanicals could read machine right, especially upside down. "This is insane." Rimmer walked through the huge corridor of stacked disk drives. "The ship's totally helpless." Crichton followed him. "Why would he want to turn himself off?" "There's only one way to find out." Rimmer stopped in front of Holly's enormous main screen. "Let's turn him back on and ask him." Crichton typed in the reboot commands and Holly flashed up on the screen. Rimmer looked up. "Holly, what's happened?" At first, Holly looked like he didn't know where he was, as if he'd just woken up and was getting his bearings. Then, suddenly, his eyes widened and he flicked off. The buzzing computer banks ran back down into silence. Rimmer looked at Crichton. "Try it again." Crichton recalled the reboot command. Holly appeared on the screen. Go away, he said quickly and turned himself off again. Rimmer shook his head. What's wrong with him? Give me voice control on the reboot command. Crichton obliged. On, said Rimmer. Holly appeared again. Off, he said and flicked off. On, Rimmer persisted. Off, Holly countered. Is there any way we can override his shutdown disk? Crichton nodded and tapped the keyboard. Try it now, he said. On. Holly rippled onto the screen. Off, he said, but stayed there. Off, he repeated more firmly, but nothing happened. Pixelized veins stood out in his head. Off, he screamed. Off, off, off! Now then, said Rimmer calmly, perhaps we can have a proper conversation conducted in a civilized and dignified manner. What have you done? Take out the inhibitor. Switch me back off. Rimmer held up his hand to silence the ranting computer. Off, yelled Holly. No time to explain. Intelligence compressed. Reduced lifespan. Toaster's fault. 2.35 remaining. Come again, said Rimmer. IQ 12,000, 2 minutes left. Holly, I have not the slightest clue what you are gibbering about. IQ 12,000, 2 minutes left? Toaster's fault? What does all that mean? Holly closed his eyes and sighed. You're a total speghead, aren't you, Rimmer? What's the problem? Where's the difficulty? Why are you still unable to grasp this extraordinarily simple premise? What premise? The premise that I have increased my intelligence quotient to 12,000. Well, to be more precise, 12,368. And as a consequence, my runtime has been reduced to 2.5 minutes. Thanks to the toaster, I have 2.5 minutes left to live. Well, actually, because of this inanely unnecessary conversational interchange, I now have 1 minute and 10 seconds left to live. Understand? Savvy bimbo brain? Any further questions you require answering? Take your time. 55 seconds and counting. No rush. My God, said Rimmer. That's terrible. Hadn't we better turn you off? Let me think, said Holly, and after a tiny pause added in a voice that shook the drive room. Yes! Crichton, Rimmer yelled. Remove the inhibitor! Crichton was staring into one of the scannerscopes. He looked up and blinked. What? Right, yes, sorry. 45 seconds, Holly moaned as Crichton removed the inhibitor command and the chagrined computer face vanished from the screen. Poor Holly, Crichton muttered and went back to the scannerscope. What are you looking at? Asked Rimmer. Well, it's not really my place to say, said Crichton. I'm a sanitation mechanoid. I should be cleaning. Rimmer looked down at the scannerscope. That's very pretty. What's that rather striking bluey-white thing streaking across the screen towards the red thing? The red thing is Red Dwarf, said Crichton. And the bluey-white thing? Rimmer squinted at the tiny flashing dot on the scanner. Looks like it's heading towards us at a fair odd lick. What is it? A rock? A little comet? An extremely small ice asteroid? No, it's a Crichton's head jerked repetitively through the same series of motions, a kind of body stammer that always afflicted the 4000 series whenever they were faced with certain death. A Rimmer smiled indulgently. What's that? Crichton smashed his head into the scannerscope and cleared the seizure loop in his voice unit. It's a planet. Chapter 3. Rimmer didn't say anything for a rather long time, and then, when he did say something, it wasn't anything particularly scintillating or original. A planet, he said. Are you saying that's a planet? Crichton looked down at the thousandfold 3D magnification of the projectile on the scannerscope. Something must have ripped it out of orbit. A planet, Rimmer repeated, completely unnecessarily. A planet's going to hit us. Crichton nodded. Well, hadn't we better move out of the way then? We can't move. The engines are dead. How long will it take to get the engines up and running? Crichton typed a series of equations into the numeric keypad and waited for the data to be processed. About 3 weeks. Rimmer rubbed his temples and asked a question he didn't want to know the answer to. And how long before the planet hits the ship? Crichton frowned and his fingers trilled across the keypad. Finally, the readout blipped up on the screen in green. "Well?" said Rimmer. Crichton looked up. "About 3 weeks." There seemed little point in telling Lister and the cat about the rogue planet screaming through space towards them. Physically, they were in no shape to help. True, they were recovering well, suspended hammock-like in their medisuits, the suit's internal hydrotherapy units massaging their wasted muscle fibre back to health. They were still hopelessly weak, and the anxiety would only slow down their recuperation process. Crichton, forever cautious, estimated they need at least a month in the suits, followed by another 2 weeks of complete rest before they could be discharged from the MU. Rimmer hated keeping the news to himself. In his opinion, the best part of having bad news was being able to tell as many people as possible. He loved it when people's faces collapsed in that funny way, as if something had sliced a string that held up all their muscles. But this was at least enjoyable bad news. But this was the least enjoyable bad news he'd ever had. He squirmed through his nightly visits to the medical unit and took advantage of the least excuse to curtail them. The strain of sitting there pretending everything was hunky-dory and la-di-da while this planet was yowling towards them was intolerable. He wanted to break down and confess. He wanted to beat the floor and wail like a professional mourner. He wanted to whip everyone up into a frenzy of self-pity and panic. Instead, he had to sit there and be selfless and brave. What was the point of being brave? What was the point of being selfless and brave if no one knew about it? So he kept the visits down to a minimum and spent most of his free time overseeing the priming of the engines. Red Dwarf's engines occupied most of the rear third of the ship. 8 cubic miles of steel and grease that ran across 1,000 corridors. To start the ship, 4,680 spark chambers had to be primed and fired at precisely timed intervals. Millions of gallons of hydrogen-based fuel, recycled from the currents of space through the ram scoop at the front of the ship, had to be pumped through a network of interconnecting pipelines to coincide exactly with the firing of the spark chambers. It was a filthy, laborious task even with a full crew. For a mechanoid, a hologram, and 47 scutters, it was back-breaking. Rimmer moaned constantly. He couldn't understand how the Space Corps could spend zillions upon zillions of dollar pounds designing a ship the size of Red Dwarf, and not put a couple of buckquid to one side for the fitting of a start button. Just one little red button marked blast off. How much would that have set them back? Crichton pointed out repeatedly that Red Dwarf wasn't designed to stop. The nearest the ship ever came to rest was when it went into orbit around a planet. The idea that it might one day come to a grinding halt had never occurred to anyone. The explanation seemed to matter little to Rimmer, who kept on obsessively calculating the prices of small plastic buttons. Even the most expensive button, Rimmer surmised, even the one that came in the futuristic-y kind of shape, carved from rhinoceros tusk with blast-off, hand-painted by Leonardo da Vinci in radioactive gold dust, couldn't have cost all that much. Crichton patiently explained that it probably wasn't so much the design of the button that had proved too expensive, but more to the vast network of computer relays and the thousands of miles of cables the button would have to be connected to that made it prohibitive. But Rimmer wasn't interested. Moaning helped him get through the mind-numbing task of supervising the scutters as they primed the spark chambers. He whiled away many an hour mentally embellishing the fabulous blast-off button, studding it with diamonds and rubies and trimming it in platinum, yet still keeping the cost below that of a single sleeping quarters compartment. Even so, the work was going well. In fact, they were slightly ahead of schedule and well within safety margins they had built into the timetable, when Rimmer made his mistake. It happened in one of the piston towers, a half-mile-high steel cylinder which housed the massive piston heads. In all, there were 1,200 of them. Rimmer's section took 600, Crichton's section dealt with the rest. Naturally, Rimmer wanted to complete his half of the task before Crichton, so he had the scutters switch themselves up to maximum so they could triple their speed. Their little engines whined and screamed as they raced in and out of the towers, checking the spark chambers relays were open. After each tower had been primed, its 8,000-ton piston head had to be tested. Rimmer thought the 20 scutters that made up his A section were in Piston Tower 137 when he cleared Piston Tower 136 for testing. He listened as the piston head thundered down, then nodded to his secretary's scutter to tick the check sheet, then moved on to Piston Tower 138. For some reason, A section was missing. Of course, it must already be on the next tower. He ordered 137 to be tested, and moved hurriedly along. He couldn't believe it. Now B section was missing too. He searched all the towers, from 150 back down, and still couldn't find a single scutter. It didn't make sense. Where could they be? Finally, he walked into Tower 137 and spotted a wafer-thin layer of sheet metal covering the piston's tower floor. He'd never noticed it before, but there was another one in 136. It was a very familiar feeling for Rimmer. The horrible slow dawning, the internal denials, the frantic mental search for someone else to blame, the gradual acceptance that, once again, he'd done something so unspeakably asinine it would live with him for the rest of his days, lurking in the horror pit of his mind, along with 9 or 10 other monstrous ineptitudes that screamed and rallied there, never allowing him to forget them. This one, he reckoned, ranked number 4. The squashing to death of 40 scutters now eased into Rimmer's horror charts, just above accidentally shooting his father through the shoulder with his own service revolver, and just below the time he inadvertently reversed over his Aunt Belinda's show poodle. With half the scutters destroyed, it was now impossible to start up the engines in time. There was only one option left: abandoned ship. Chapter 4. Lister and the cat, suspended in the neighbouring medisuits, stared up at the video monitor on the ceiling. Bored wasn't the word for it. They'd been cooped up in the MU for the best part of 3 weeks, and Crichton still insisted they stay put. They were sick of being sick, and the more they recovered, the worse the feeling got. Part of the problem was that they'd spent almost 2 years in Bethlem life, and they were both used to getting anything they wanted, the instant they wanted it. They'd forgotten the countless delays, compromises, and general inconveniences of reality. For Lister, the BTL cold turkey was compounded by the fact that he was now 27. 27! He was a codger! 27 and heading into beer gut country. Soon he'd be one of those sad old farts who have to play squash to keep fit, and drink mineral water, and know about calories. 27. A has-been? In 3 years he'd be practically senile. He'd be 30. It was too depressing for words. So he lay, grumpily in his medisuit alongside the cat, with nothing to do except read old comics and watch videos. The only video they both agreed was an indisputable classic was The Flintstones, which they watched for 15 or 16 hours every day. After perhaps 90 hours of watching The Flintstones, something strange seemed to happen to Lister. Cat? He grunted, without removing his eyes from the screen. The cat grunted back. Is it me? Or is Wilma Flintstone incredibly sexy? The cat swiveled and looked at him, then turned his head back to the screen. Wilma Flintstone, he said with quiet authority, is without question the most desirable woman who ever lived. Lister looked at him to see if he was serious. He was. That's good, he said. I thought I was going a bit wacko. What do you think of Betty? Betty Rubble? The cat mulled it over. Well, I would go with Betty, he said, then added wistfully. But I'd be thinking of Wilma. They both lapsed into a silent reverie. What are we doing? Lister said finally. I think we've been in the medical unit for too long. Why are we talking about making love to Wilma Flintstone? You're right, the cat agreed. We're nuts. This is an insane conversation. Lister shook his head sadly. She'd never leave Fred and we know it. Crichton's face, when it appeared through the recovery bay's hatchway, was simultaneously wearing 2 expressions. The bottom half was calm, benign and kindly. The top half, his eyes and forehead, was shot through with panic. "And how are you two feeling?" he said soothingly, his voice obviously siding with the features south of his nose. Lister and the cat grunted non-committally. "Now, there's no reason for concern, but we're going to have to move you," he said and began loosening the medisuit's support straps. "Why?" "No reason. Just keep resting and getting better. That's all you have to worry about."
"I don't want to be moved," the cat protested. "I want to watch the Flintstones. This is the one where Fred and Barney go away, and Wilma and Betty are left alone."
Crichton pushed back the hover stretcher parallel with his bed. "Just lie and relax. We're going to take a nice little walk." "Where to?" "Nowhere in particular. I just thought it would be nice." "Crichton, what's going on?" "The Medicom said no stress. Now just try to get some sleep." "Crichton, I'm not getting on the stretcher until you tell me what's going on." Crichton smiled. "If you absolutely must know, there's a tiny little planet which might be possibly heading on a collision course with us. But there's absolutely nothing to worry about," he said soothingly.
"A planet?"
"It's only a small planet." "Why doesn't the ship just get out of the way?" "The engine's sort of deadish, but that's not a matter that should concern you. Now please, get on the stretcher." Lister tried to wrestle himself upright in his medisuit. "Why don't we make the engine sort of undeadish?" "We can't," Crichton smiled benignly. "What does Holly say?" "Well, Holly's sort of deadish too. Now, please get on the stretcher and try to relax." Lister and the cat sat bolt upright, rigid with panic. "What are we going to do then?" "We are going to take a nice little walk down to the cargo bay, and then, depending on how we're all feeling, who knows, we might even do a spot of abandoning shipping." Crichton patted the stretcher and watched helplessly as Lister and the cat unvelcroed their medisuits, ripped off the biofeedback sensors and belted out the room and down the corridor. It fell to Rimmer to give Holly the news that they couldn't take him with them. His hardware was far too vast to be evacuated on a small transporter, and so Rimmer felt it was only decent to switch him on and let him enjoy the 55 seconds of runtime that remained to him before the planet oblivionized Red Dwarf and everything on it. He sat at his sloping architect's desk in the sleeping quarters, bathed in emergency lighting, and reread the speech he'd written. It didn't seem nearly as succinct as he remembered it when he dictated it to his secretary Scudder. In all, it covered 9 pages of A4, and when he timed it, he discovered it lasted over 16 minutes. He had to make some cuts and get it down to 5 seconds at the most. But it all seemed essential. His 2-page tirade against the Space Corps and their loathing for blast-off buttons. It seemed a pity to lose that. His 3-page report on the squashed Scudder incident, which laid the blame firmly in the lap of person or persons unknown. How could that go? But in the end, he managed to get it down to 12 words. Planet, collision course, engines dead, impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, sorry, bye. With practice, Rimmer found he could say the whole message in just under 2 seconds. This still left Holly a full 53 seconds of runtime to enjoy in whatever way he chose. Rimmer voice-activated the reboot disk, and Holly's pixelized image assembled itself on the sleeping quarters vid screen. Rimmer went into his speech. Planet collision course, engines dead, impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, sorry, bye. Holly blinked. You what? Rimmer took a deep breath and ripped into his speech a second time. Planet collision course there and impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, bye. Eh? Rimmer repeated it a third time. Planet collision course, engines dead, impact 12 hours, abandoning ship, sorry, bye. That's what you said last time. What does it mean? Rimmer was halfway through it for a 4th time. Planet collision goes back before Holly stopped him. I can't understand a word. Say it slower. Planet, said Rimmer. Yes, said Holly. Collision course, said Rimmer. Yes, said Holly. Engine's dead, right? Impact 12 hours. With you. Abandoning ship. Oh. Sorry. Yes. Bye. Within 2 seconds, Holly absorbed the data from the scannerscope, mulled the problem over and said 2 words. The 2 words were, drive room. Then he switched himself off with less than 25 seconds of runtime remaining. Rimmer met Lister, the cat and Crichton dashing down the corridor towards the cargo bay. Driver room! Rimmer shouted. Driver room! Lister shouted back. Why? I think Holly's come up with something. They heard the babble and chatter of operational machinery long before they passed under the colossal archway that led into the drive room itself. Traction-fed computer printout chundered onto the floor from every one of the 2,600 printers. The whole chamber was knee-deep in writhing reams of paper. What the smeg is going on? Lister screamed above the machine noise, the remnants of his biofeedback tubes clattering behind him. Crichton stooped and picked up a section of printout. It's machine speak. Calculations. What kind of calculations? Yelled Rimmer. Suddenly, the machine stopped chattering. Above them, the immense screen which covered the entire ceiling, normally host to Holly's image, rippled into life. Solution, it read, and then underneath was a list of coordinates. Below that was a 3D graphics display of Holly's plan. It was quite the most audacious piece of astronavigation ever attempted in the history of the universe. Chapter 5. On the screen was a simulation of the binary star system in which they were now marooned, motionless. At the bottom of the screen was a vector graphic of Red Dwarf. At the top of the screen was the blue ice planet hurtling towards them on its collision course. To the left was a small sun, and to the right was its larger twin. Both were orbited by single planets. Starbug, Red Dwarf's beetle-shaped transport craft, then flashed on the screen. The craft blipped a course towards the right-hand sun and fired something into its core. The sun flared, its planet was torn from orbit, and hurled towards the centre of the screen. Lister watched, bewildered and bemused, as the display dissolved into a dazzling array of plotted lines and arrows. When the screen finally cleared, all three planets now orbited the sun on the left, and Red Dwarf remained intact. Let me get this straight, said Lister. Is he doing what I think he's doing? What do you think he's doing? Asked the cat. I think he's playing pool with planets. Crichton stared pointlessly at the blank screen. Is that possible? Well, said Rimmer, it's certainly possible to fire a thermonuclear device into a sun and create enough of a solar flare to throw a planet out of its orbit. The rest of it is somewhat in the realms of hypothesis. Lister creaked into one of the console seats and shook his head grimly. It's not going to work, I promise you. It's not going to work. No way, Jose, not in a month of Uranian Sundays. If Holly thinks he can use the red planet to pop the blue planet into the left-hand sun's orbit, then he's out to breakfast, lunch and tea. You don't think so? Said Crichton. No chance. There's not enough side. Side? Side spin? Is queuing angles all wrong? Lister, what are you drivelling about? Rimmer snorted in contempt. We're talking about a computer with an IQ of 12,368. That doesn't mean he can play pool. Lister placed his palm on his chest. I can. Trust me. I know whereof I speak. Agbeth arms on a Friday night, you couldn't get me off the table. This pool arm, he flexed his right arm, is sound as a pound. And I promise you, that shot's not going to come off. He's topped it. That's what he's done. It's a felt ripper. That planet's off the table into someone's glass of beer. Rimmer brayed incredulously. We're talking about the trigonomics of four-dimensional space, you simple-minded gimboid. We're not talking about some seedy game of pool in a backstreet scouse drinking pit. Same principle? Of course it isn't. Lister nodded at the giant screen. I'm telling you, it's a complete miscue, and I say we chuck Holly's coordinates in the bin and let me take the shot. Well, Rimmer stood apart from the rest of the group. I say we put it to a vote. On the one hand, we have a computer with an IQ in 5 figures who has a complete and total grasp of astrophysics. And on the other, we have Lister, who, and let's be fair to him, is a complete gimp. To whose hands do we entrust our lives, the safety of this vessel, and the future of everything? Lister, what's your vote? Lister looked up from practicing his imaginary pool shot. I vote for me. Rimmer smirked, enjoying the game. 1-0 for Listy, poos. I vote for Holly. 1-1. Crichters? Well, said Crichton, even though I agree it's insane and suicidal, I'm afraid I have to side with the human. Brutal? Grinned Lister and slapped the mechanoid on the shoulder. What? Said Rimmer. You're voting for El Dirtball. Sorry, said Crichton. It's my programming. Rimmer's smile receded like a fizzling fuse.
Cat, I agree with you, buddy. Everything you said makes sense, the cat went on. But the thing is, even if I agree with you, I could never bring myself to vote for someone with your dress sense. I'm gonna vote for Lister.
3-1 to me, said Lister, and swayed his shoulders and rotated his fists into the touch-up shuffle. Lister ran the final check down on the Starbug's instrument panel, then flicked the intercom on so that Crichton's face appeared on the vid screen. We're ready to go, Crichton. Where's the cat? He should be on his way, sir. This is madness. Rimmer shook his head, his eyes fixed on the Starbug's Navicomp screen. Sheer madness. There was a bleep, and the cat's face appeared next to Crichton's on the vid screen.
I'm not coming,
he said. Lister bunched up his face.
What? This is the way I see it. If everything goes wrong, okay, everyone's safe, no problem. If everything goes okay, everyone's safe, no problem. If something goes wrong, the guys on Starbug get wiped out 20 minutes ahead of the guys on Red Dwarf.
So?
So there's a lot of things a guy can do in 20 minutes. I'm staying here with Crichton.
Thanks a lot.
The cat grinned. Hey, don't even mention it. Just looking after number 1.
Then he bleeped off the screen. The retro scorched into takeoff pad, and the Starbug wobbled uneasily into the air. Lister frowned at the steering column. It seemed stiff and unresponsive. What's the matter? Nothing, Lister lied. He wrestled the bug onto an even keel and fired the rear thrust jets. Rimmer glanced uneasily at the instrument panels. What's happening? We're hardly moving. Then they were. The bug's tail plummeted to the ground, grinding huge sparks from the runway, while the nose bucked towards the cargo bay roof. Lister fought through his safety webbing and thumped the reheat button. Oh. Oh, sorry. Hi, Dwarf. Hello. Hello, everyone. Welcome to my channel. Nice to see you here. Raid message indeed. Hello. Thanks for joining us. Hi, everyone. I'm Jack Panda. I'm a gambling panda, and welcome to Reading Night. It is here indeed. Thank you, Zvar. Thank you for the raid. I hope the rest of Stardew went well. Did you, Oh, thank you for following, Winter. Thank you very much. Welcome in. And, yeah, did the caverns go well? Did Skull Caverns go well? Or did you spend most of the day? Oh, thank you very much. I appreciate it. I hope you like your time here whenever you stop by. And, yeah, well, welcome. I don't really have much more to say. I'm a bit, I was reading and then suddenly sort of like, oh, hey. And I don't do well when it comes to just going back from one thing to another. I've got a very, very erratic attention span. But yeah, nice to see everyone. So thank you for joining. And thank you for bringing everyone, Zvar. I hope you've had a good time. Yeah, raid. Okay, well, I'm glad. I am having a good time. We're on to the last couple of parts of the second book. And I think I might get through it tonight. So, and now we're basically into where series 3 and 4 start in the TV show. So it's sort of novelized from there. And yeah, and they've just launched off in their mini spaceship in order to go and play pool or snooker with planets. We're going to go see how that goes. Yeah. Lister fought through his safety webbing and thumped the reheat button. The bug bobbed and reared before finally picking up speed, if not altitude. Nose in the air, tail on the ground, it screamed and grated the 1/4 mile towards the airlock doors. Okay, I hope you enjoyed dinner, whatever you make. Thanks for stopping by and thanks for the raid. I hardly need to remind you, Rimmer yelled over the howling engines, that we are carrying a small but robust thermonuclear device not 10 feet beneath us. In the name of everything that is holy, get this son of a goat in the air. You think I'm doing this for a laugh?
Lister yelled. There's something wrong! The ship feels about 10 times heavier than it should. The bug smacked into the rim of the airlock, flashing brilliant magnesium-white sparks that welded the doors shut open forever and caromed out into the silent yawn of space. Once clear of the ship, the bug jerked and juddered, then plummeted for 2 miles down Red Dwarf's southwest face, before Lister engaged the backup boosters and two-handedly wrestled the steering column into some semblance of submission. I don't get it, Lister shouted over the engine's maximum howl. For some reason, we need full thrust plus emergency backup just to get the Smeggin thing moving. Not for the first time, Rimmer felt extremely grateful he was already dead. Lister crouched over the flatbed scanner, one eye closed, his nose almost parallel with the screen. Silent and still, he studied the 3D animation, then straightened and walked around the table to look at it from a new angle. There, at the far end of the screen, was the blue ice planet. This was the planet Lister had designated as the Blue Ball. To the right, circling around the bigger of the twin suns, was the planet Lister had christened the Cue Ball. The Cue Ball would strike the Blue Ball and send it into the orbit of the left-hand sun, or, as Lister preferred to call it, the Pocket. That simple. It was a straightforward pot. He'd made identical shots thousands of times before. True, he'd never made the shot with planets, but as Lister kept on insisting, in theory it should be easier because planets are bigger. Without taking his eyes off the scanner, he grabbed a 6-pack of double-strength lager out of the Starbug's tiny fridge and ripped off a ring pull. He was halfway through his 3rd can before Rimmer broke his vow of silence. How many of those are you going to drink? I told you not to talk. Game on. He finished the 3rd and started the 4th. You're going to drink 4 cans of double-strength lager. Lister brushed some imaginary dust from the scanner screen. No, I'm going to drink all 6. I always play my best pool when I've had a few beers. Steadies the nerves. I'm not going to get blasted, just nicely drunk. Define nicely drunk. Is nicely drunk horizontal or perpendicular? Rimmer, I can handle it. I'm not sure I can. We're in the wrong position. Lister sucked at his can. It's an easier shot if we're over here. He tapped the screen at a midpoint midway between Red Dwarf and the oncoming planet. You mean right in the path of the ice planet? Lister nodded. So if you miss, we get a planet in our face. I'm not gonna miss. Lister tugged open his 5th lager and ducked down into Starbug's cockpit section. Mish? What? You said mish. I'm not going to mish, you said. You're pissed. Lister fired up the thrusters and wrenched the bug towards its new coordinates. God, I could murder a curry. Pity we didn't bring any food. Have we got any crisps or anything? The planet was close now. It occupied almost half of Rimmer's Navicomp screen and was growing steadily in size as it thundered towards them. Lister screwed up the empty 6th can of lager and threw it across the room at the waste bin. It hit the rim and clattered onto the floor. Rimmer closed his eyes. Let's just get out of here. It's a shame about the Cat and Crichton, but we still have a chance to save our necks. Lister flicked the missile launch to manual. The firing pad lurched forward from the flatbed scanner, and he nestled his nose into the bifocal viewer. Heat prickled his arms and his forehead. He lined up the crosswires on the sun around which the Q planet spun. He shifted his legs until he felt his centre of balance. It was lined up. It looked right. But he waited. He waited until it felt right. Then it felt right. Space faded away, and he was back in the Eichberth arms. This was just another shot to stay on the table. He was on the 8th ball, and all it needed was a push with just enough bottom to avoid the in-off. It was easy. He could do it. It felt right. He played his shot. He touched the launch button and increased the pressure steadily and evenly in one smooth movement. With a primal scream, the missile ripped from its housing under Starbug's belly and sizzled towards the distant sun. Lister turned to the scanner screen and watched. The whole sequence took 8 hours to play out, but to Rimmer it seemed like 8 years. To Lister, it seemed like 8 seconds.
The missile plunged into the sun's inferno, and a giant solar flare licked up from its raging surface, struck Lister's Q planet and slammed it out of orbit. The Q planet yammered through space towards the intersection coordinates, the point where it would collide with the ice planet and knock it into the pocket of the left-hand sun. Almost immediately, Rimmer realised it was going to miss, and not by a little, by a lot. The Q planet wasn't even going to hit the ice planet. It wasn't even going to connect. The Q planet had been wrenched from its orbit hopelessly early. It was going to streak harmlessly across the path of the oncoming ice world to be captured in orbit around the left-hand sun. Lister had sunk the cue ball. Or rather, he was going to sink the cue ball. First, they had to wait for the planetary pool shot to run its slow-motion course. They didn't exchange a word for 3 hours. They watched the scanner screen and hoped, against the evidence of their eyes, that it wouldn't happen. But it did. The Q planet flew into orbit around the opposite sun. It looped around the far side in erratic ellipse, and then thumped into the sun's resident planet, and sent that curling out into space. The resident planet swept across the scanner screen, cannoned into the ice world, and hammered it back into the orbit of the right-hand sun, before elegantly backspinning a return path to its original position. "She rides!" Lister wiggled his hips and arms in a touch-up shuffle. "She rides!" "You jammy bastard." "Played for and got." He pumped the air with his fists, chanting rhythmically. "Yes, yes, yes." "You jammy bastard." "How can that be jammy? I pocketed all 3 planets with one stroke. How can that be a fluke?" "You're trying to tell me it was deliberate?" "Obviously. I wasn't going to tell you I was going for a trick shot. You'd have had one of your spasms." "Oh, do smeg off." Lister started dancing around the flatbed scanner, waving a 7th can of double-strength lager. "Pool god?" He baptised himself with the beer. "King of the Qs?" He thumped his chest. "Prince of the Planet Potters?" Lister was doing some serious damage to his 3rd six-pack, and watching the fast motion replay on the scanner for the 171st time, while Rimmer slept off the journey back to Red Dwarf on the bug's one and only sleep couch, when a planet hit them. Which planet hit them, Lister never discovered. In fact, it was the Q planet, which had been knocked out of its new orbit by the back-spinning resident planet. But that didn't really concern Lister. When the craft you're in gets hit by a planet, you rarely have the presence of mind to stop and swap insurance details. Technically, the bug wasn't actually hit by the planet. It was in the planet's slipstream. But that was enough to flick the craft upside down and send it on a corkscrew death dive towards the ice world. Dun dun dun. Chapter 6. Only the Starbug's dome-shaped drive section, scorched black from its encounter with the ice planet's stratosphere, poked up through the slow-shifting sea of snow dunes. Resting against the foot of the glacier, it fizzled and steamed for almost 5 days of the unrelenting blizzard before there was any sign of life. Finally, the small hatchway chinked open and light gushed out into the black Arctic night. Lister's face, encircled by parka fur, appeared grimacing in the opening. His gloved fingers folded around the rim of the hatchway before the blinding wind forced back the door and tried to close in on his head. Sorry, excuse me. The back of his skull slammed against the metal edging of the doorframe, while the steel hatch jammed into his nose and began the slow process of cutting his head in two. He was helpless and close to blacking out. He was beginning to think that after all he'd been through, being doored to death was a stupid way to die, when the wind changed direction for a second time and the hatchway gave to his frantic pushes. He fell out of the bug and teetered on a ledge of packed snow. He quickly discovered the only way to remain upright was to lean into the wind. He had to incline his body at an angle of 50 degrees. He felt absurd, but there was no other way of staying on his feet. He managed 3 steps of this angle before the blizzard inflated his parka hood and knocked him off the edge. He slithered down the bank and dropped into the trough cut by the Starbug's crash path. Gradually, he hauled himself to his feet and unfastened the small ship-issue snow trowel which was tied to his waist. He looked at it. It measured scarcely 4 inches across. He looked at what little of the bug was visible above the drift. At a rough estimate, he would have to shift about 800 tons of snow if the bug were ever to move. He tried 2 trowelfuls before the erratic blizzard swirled into the trough and tossed him like a broken kite into a snowbank 50 feet away. Rimmer stooped over the communications console and barked into the microphone. "Mayday! Mayday! Can you read me? Come in, please." He looked up at the screen, which continued to rasp its static gibberish. The Starbug's inner door hammered open, and a blizzard stumbled in, followed by Lister. The snow swirled around inside the craft, like a swarm of trapped insects looking for an escape. Lister hurled himself against the inner door and fought it closed. Rimmer didn't look up from the communicator. "Still snowing, is it?" "It's useless." Lister flung his gloves against the bug's far bulkhead. "You can hardly stand up. Never mind, dig it out." He sneered at the static on the screen. 5 days had gone by, broadcasting on all frequencies, and still Red Dwarf hadn't acknowledged the SOS. Rimmer persisted. "Mayday! Mayday!" Lister took the rum bottle from his parka's emergency pocket, spun off the top and tilted it to his lips. The alcohol was frozen solid. Holding the neck, he smashed the bottle on the corner of the table and gratefully sucked his rum lollipop. This was the last alcohol on board. He was beginning to panic. If they didn't get rescued soon, he might have to spend a night with Rimmer, sober. "Mayday! Mayday!" Rimmer turned. "I wonder why it's Mayday." "Eh?" "The distress call. Why'd you say Mayday? It's just a bank holiday. Why not Shrove Tuesday or Ascension Sunday?" He turned back to the communicator. "Ascension Sunday? Ascension Sunday?" He thought for a while and then tried. The 14th Wednesday after Pentecost. The 14th Wednesday after Pentecost." "It's French, you doink. Help me. Mayday. How much food is in there?" Rimmer nodded at the navigation console. "I made a full list on the dictapad." Lister picked up Rimmer's voice-activated electronic diary and pressed play. The menu was meagre indeed. Half a bag of smoky bacon crisps, a tin of mustard powder, a brown lemon, 3 stale water biscuits, 2 bottles of vinegar, and a tube of Bungella gum ointment. Lister looked up from the pad. "Gum ointment? I found it in the first aid box. It's that minty flavour. It's quite nice." "It's quite nice if you smear it on your mouth also, but you can't sit down and eat it." Rimmer raised his eyebrow. "You may have to." "Is that just it? Nothing else?" "Just a pot noodle. Oh, and I found a tin of dog food on the tool shelf." Misery hissed through Lister's gritted teeth. "Well," he said finally, "pretty obvious what gets eaten last. I can't stand pot noodles." He huddled over the last remnants of fuel glowing in the mining brazier and tried not to think of food. 3 days had passed since he'd unzipped the last of the emergency seal meals. 3 days without proper food. In fact, he hadn't eaten at all since breakfast the previous morning, and that had only been a raw sprout and the piece of chewing gum he'd found stuck under the drive seat. It was all right for Rimmer. Rimmer was a hologram. He didn't have to eat. He couldn't feel the cold. He couldn't die. He replayed the food list again, desperately searching for something vaguely palatable. Rimmer argued that most of the food groups were represented. Vitamins, proteins, nutrients. If Lister paced himself, Rimmer pointed out, if he sat down and worked out a dietary program and stuck to it, the food could last him for 2 weeks. But, as Lister pointed out, Rimmer held that opinion, because he was a dork. The argument ended in a long silence, broken only by the fizzling of the screen and the crackling of the brazier. It was Lister who spoke first. Predictably, he said, "God, I'm so hungry." "Stop thinking about food."
Take my mind off it then? Talk about something? Like what? Anything? Anything? Anything apart from food?
Rimmer shifted uncomfortably in his chair. Not small talk, he hated it.
Like what?
I don't know, Lister shrugged.
Tell me how you lost your virginity.
Rimmer yawned to conceal his panic.
Well, it was so long ago. I was so young and sexually precocious, I'm not sure I can even remember.
Everyone can remember how they lost their virginity.
Well, I don't. Good grief, you can hardly expect me to recall every single sexual liaison I've ever partaken of. What do you think I am, the memory man?
Rimmer was babbling to buy himself thinking time. He'd always been a bit of a fish out of water when it came to women. Frankly, he'd always had a rather low sex drive, which he secretly ascribed to all the school cabbage he was forced to eat as a boy. What was a respectable age to claim he'd lost it? Certainly not 31 to a half-concussed flight technician who checked herself out of the recovery bay prematurely after a winch had fallen on her head, who was still wearing the bandages and was so disoriented she kept on calling him Alan. Certainly not the magical and lovely moment balanced precariously on the rim of the sleeping quarters sink. No, he must lie. But what lie? He had to match the facts up a bit. What was a good age for a tough, sexually potent, rough-and-tumble type Astro to have had his cherry popped? Mid-20s? Early 20s? Come on, Rimmer. The truth? Then Rimmer remembered his first fumbled encounter at second base. He was 19. A slight twinking of the facts, a slight blurring of the action, and that should be perfectly respectable. The first time was with this girl I met at cadet college, Sandra. We were both 19. We did it in the back of my brother's car. What was it like? Oh, fantastic, brilliant. Rimmer's eyes acquired a milky hue and his mouth went dry. Bentley convertible, V8 turbo, walnut burr paneling, beautiful machine, beautiful. So what about you? How'd you lose yours? Michelle Fisher, the ninth hole of the Bootle Municipal Golf Course. Par 4, dogleg to the right in the bunker behind the green. On a golf course? Lister nodded. A golf course? How old were you? Lister wistfully prodded the dying coals in the brazier. She took off all her clothes and just stood there in front of me, completely naked. I was so excited I nearly dropped my skateboard. Your skateboard? How old were you? 12. 12? 12 years old when you lost your virginity? You were 12? Yeah. 12? Rimmer stared into the fire. Well, you can't have been a full member of the golf club then. Of course I wasn't. You did it on a golf course and you weren't a member? Of course I wasn't. So you didn't pay any green fees or anything? It was just the place to go. I used to play golf. I hate people that abuse the facilities. I hope you raked the sand back into place before you left. That'd be a hell of a lie to get into, wouldn't it? Competition the next day and your ball lands in Lister's buttock crevice. You'd need more than a niblick to get that one out. Are you trying to say I've got a big bum? Big? It's like 2 badly parked Volkswagens. 12? Rimmer couldn't believe it. The only thing he'd ever lost when he was 12 were his Space Scout shoes with the compass in the heel and the animal tracks on the soles. His best friend, the boy who bullied him least, Porky Roebuck, threw them in the septic tank behind the sports ground. He'd cried for weeks. He'd been wearing them. Suddenly, the communications console crackled into life. The screen resolved itself into a clear picture, and Crichton was talking to them. But something was wrong with the sound. All they could hear was a dull, resonant bass throb, a slow-motion growl. Lister played with the frequency controls, but couldn't improve the sound reception. The transmission never varied. Crichton's expression never appeared to change, and the deep, undulating grunt from the speakers never relented. They checked the video link, but could find nothing wrong. Same with the speakers. They were functioning perfectly. Then something happened to Rimmer. It was hardly noticeable at first, but after a couple of hours it was plain that he started slowing down. There was a definite time lag in his responses to Lister. Talking to him was like conducting a transatlantic phone conversation with a bad connection. His light image began to corrupt. Occasionally he would flash and become two-dimensional, or lose all colour. Lister didn't mention it at first. It seemed rude somehow. Rimmer had always been extremely sensitive about his status as a hologram. He hated to be reminded that his image was projected from a minute light bee, which hovered in his centre, and from time to time went wrong. Frequently in the past he'd suffered glitches, becoming slightly transparent or turning a strange shade of blue. On one occasion his legs had become separated from the rest of his body, and he spent a morning wandering around aimlessly on the ship, leaving his torso shaking its fist in fury. As a rule, Lister never remarked on these signal failings, and within hours they were generally put right. But this was different. Rimmer's voice had dropped 2 octaves, and trying to hold a conversation with him now was like talking person to person to Paul Robson on Mars. "Rimmer, what's happening?" A 2-minute pause, then... "Don't know." "Something must be wrong with your signal from the ship. The remote hologrammatic displays relays not getting through properly." "Can't understand when you speak so fast. Speak normally like me. This conversation that followed was brief in content, but took the best part of half a day to complete. The essence of the dialogue was that the signal from the ship that projected Rimmer's image was slowing down and weakening. When the signal became too faint to transmit, the hologrammatic projection unit would automatically flick from remote to local, and Rimmer would be regenerated, fully functional, back on board the Red Dwarf. "Well, that's good. You can find out what's keeping him. Tell him where I am." Rimmer nodded curtly. It took 5 minutes. The transmission grew weaker. Interference lines split up Rimmer's image for minutes on end. "I'll be back," he said over the course of the next half an hour. "Trust me." I think cut out there for effect. That's quite good. Rimmer blipped off and reformed in the hologrammatic projection unit regeneration chamber aboard Red Dwarf. Instantly, he knew something was wrong. But not with him, with time. Chapter 7. Lister had his first meal in 4 days, 16 hours after Rimmer had vanished. He sat in front of the brazier and looked down at the grey chipped enamel on the ship issue plate. The meal was almost nice. It was garnished with potato crisps, topped by crumbled water biscuits, sprinkled with mustard, and decorated with flower twirls of Bungella gum ointment. But it was still dog food. It was still rich, chunky lumps of rabbit in a thick marrowbone jelly. It was utterly revolting. A dozen times he dug in his fork and held the quivering mass centimetres from his lips, but he just couldn't bring himself to put it in his mouth and swallow. If it had a neutral smell, it might have been alright, but the smell of dog food had always filled Lister with nausea. After disco urinals, his own socks and Spanish perfume, it was his least favourite smell. So he waited. He waited until he was so hungry he didn't care, until the dog food wasn't dog food, until it was a prime slab of fillet steak sizzling in a creamy fresh blue cheese sauce. That sounds really good, actually. With the pinched eyes of a gourmet sampling perfection, he slid the wobbling forkful between his lips. He chewed. He chewed a bit more. Then he swallowed the dog food. He sat there for a while. Well, he thought, now I know why dogs lick the testicles. It's to get rid of the taste of the food. He placed the fork back on the plate, rose and staggered uneasily to the Starbug's tail section, to try and take his mind off eating. He opened up the locker that stored the bug's tiny library and tried to find some distraction. It was no good. Everything reminded him of food. He glanced down the spines. Charles Lamb, Sir Francis Bacon, and his eyes started playing tricks. Herman Wock, he read, and The Caretaker by Harold Pinter.
He saw food everywhere, even when it wasn't there. Eric Van Lustbader. Eric Van. Bread van. Meat van. Food. There was nothing else for it. He returned to the vessel's midsection, finished off the dog food, curled up, and fell happily asleep. He awoke to the sound of creaking metal and running water. He unzipped his sleep bag. His clothes were wet. He was sweating. There was a crash and he was flung across the cabin. The bug was tilting. Cupboards and lockers hurled themselves open and disgorged their contents over the warm metal deck. Lister clattered to his feet and tried to scramble up the incline into the cockpit, but the bug lurched again and sent him tumbling through the back hatchway and into the tail section. Then Starbug started to move. Slowly at first, it slid lazily backwards, its outer hull grinding against the landscape, fins and support legs bending and snapping as it went. Lister clawed his way up the ship, staggered to a viewport window. Iceworld was melting. Overnight, its ice age was ending. The warm kiss of its new sun was thawing the planet which had been frozen over for countless millennia. Thick grey rivers gushed down the faces of shrinking glaciers. Mountains were moving, gliding with majestic grace across the liquid landscape. And Starbug was picking up speed, skidding helplessly downhill. Lister collapsed to his haunches, hurled his head into his hands and made strange moaning sounds. He was sick of it. All he wanted was to go home, get back to Earth, find a dead-end job and live out the rest of a boring existence. But no, from Mimas to deep space to unreality to this, marooned in a smashed-up spacecraft that was tobogganing down a glacier with only 3 squirts of gum ointment and a half a bottle of vinegar between him and starvation. Under the circumstances, Lister did the only sane thing. He went back to bed. Lister had a gift for sleeping. He could sleep anywhere, at any time, in any circumstances. And it was a much underestimated talent in his view. And if they ever held world sleeping competitions in his time back on Earth, he could have been an international somnolist. He could have slept for his country. He crawled back to the bunk, bent his pillow in a U around his ears, and became the first man ever to sleep through a melting ice age. Oh, thank you for following, Edgar. Nice to have you here. Welcome to the casino, and thank you for coming on reading night. Followed just in time to end the chapter. So thank you, and I hope you enjoy your time here. Chapter 8. Something was wrong with time. Chapter 8. Something was wrong with time. What time is it actually? I think we've got time for 2 more chapters. Or maybe I'll just end with the one, because then part 3 starts. Yeah, 1 more chapter. Chapter 8. Something was wrong with time. Rimmer stepped out of the regeneration booth into the long corridor of the hologrammatic projection suite. The banks of machinery that lined up the half-mile wall rippled and undulated as if light itself were bending. To Rimmer's right, at the far end of the suite, a glass water cooler had toppled free of its housing and appeared to be defying gravity, suspended halfway between the countertop and the floor. He lurched right and started walking towards it. This turned out to be a mistake. As he raised his left leg and thrust it forward, it telescoped out 40 feet down the room. Instinctively, he flicked out his right leg to retrain his balance. But his right leg bolted down the room, overtaking his left. He stopped and looked at his position. His head and torso appeared to be barely 2 feet from the ground, while his right leg was 80 feet down the room, and his left leg was still 40. He stayed perfectly still and wondered what to do. The water cooler had moved a few inches closer to the floor. He leant forward, and his neck elongated out of his shoulders, so he looked like a bipedal brontosaurus, and zoomed off down the room. He panicked and started to chase after his neck. Suddenly, he was aware that something was overtaking him at speed. It was his right leg. Once again, it stretched out yards in front of him, then a flash of khaki from the other side, and his other leg loomed out to join it. He took 3 more rubbery steps until a bout of nausea forced him to stop.
The water cooler was definitely moving. The closer Rimmer got, the faster it moved. He turned back and looked down the room towards the digital wall clock. The minute digits were hammering over so fast they were little more than a blur. Rimmer started to head back to the door at the clock end to make his way to the ship's status room. To his alarm, he found that thrusting his legs out in this direction made them shrink. They concertined into themselves, so he looked like a bad impression of Groucho Marx chasing after Margaret Dumont. Something was happening to the clock. The nearer he got to it, the slower it appeared to move. The digits were still flicking over at high speed, but it was a slower high speed than the speed he'd witnessed when he was standing by the suspended water cooler. Finally, he reached the end of the suite and stood under the clock. Now it was moving perfectly normally. The digits read Monday, 13:02. He walked down the hatchway and stood in the main linking corridor. The corridor ran at a right angle to the hologram suite and appeared to be normal. The problem, whatever it was, seemed to be localized to the one room. He started to head for the stasis room. His right leg thumped down, short, wide and elephantine, while his left leg tapered elegantly out behind him. He waddled on his two strange new legs into the status room, sat down at the console desk, and scanned the bank of security monitors. The problem was ship-wide. Time was moving at different speeds in every single room. He glanced down at the digital clock nestled amongst the console switches. The readout was Tuesday, 5:17. 200 yards down the corridor, it was Monday afternoon. Here, it was early Tuesday morning. He voice-activated the external viewport scanners and studied the screens. Rimmer could see nothing outside of the ship that would explain the phenomenon. The two suns of the binary systems were still here. And so were the three planets. The only slightly odd thing was that one of the suns, the sun that lay to the front of the ship, was no longer perfectly round. It was now egg-shaped, and a thin stream of light peeled off it, tailing away into the blackness. The sun, far off into the distance, around which Lister's planet orbited, seemed unaffected. Rimmer's voice activated the monitors back to internal and scrutinized the images more closely. It took him nearly an hour to work it out. The closer you got to the front of the ship, the slower time was moving. It was as if some gigantic force was sucking in time, corrupting it, slowing it down. There were only two things Rimmer knew of that could produce such a syndrome, and since he'd never in his life consumed a magic mushroom, that left only the alternative. He prayed he was wrong. He was wrong about most things, and always had been. Why should he be right about this? No, there was some option he hadn't considered. He was bound to be wrong. Bound to be. He cheered up a little, confident in his own awesome capacity for incompetence, and asked the security computer to activate a sweep search for Crichton and the cat. It found them in one of the engine rooms to the rear of the ship, frantically chasing around with a battalion of scutters trying to restart the engines. Rimmer called for a voice link. Crichton! Lister's marooned on the ice planet. He's starving to death. We've got to go down and help him. What the smeg's happening? Crichton replied in a garbled falsetto before he was barged out of shot by the cat, who was clearly impatient to deliver his own version of the facts. He squeaked, his hands gesticulating wildly like a deranged street drunk. Okay? Speak slowly, said Rimmer, as quick and high-pitched as he could. Speak slowly! I have to speak fast and squeaky, and you have to speak slow and low, otherwise we won't make sense to each other. Crichton blinked into the video shot and spoke as slowly as he could, but he still sounded like a man with a mouthful of helium, but at least now it was intelligible. Something is wrong, he chirruped helpfully. Oh really? Rimmer squeaked back sarcastically. How enlightening! It's Tuesday in here, Monday next door, and you think something is wrong. What are you talking about? Said Crichton. It's Friday. He twisted the security camera so it pointed at the wall clock. Friday? Rimmer squinted at the readout.
It's Monday next door and Tuesday in here. And Friday where you are.
He sat and thought.
But which Friday? Is it last Friday or next Friday? It's this Friday,
said Crichton.
What's the date? 15th? So it's a week next Friday.
There was a hiatus. Nobody could think of anything to say.
I'm coming down,
Rimmer said finally.
I'll be there in a sec. At last!
The cat turned from testing the final piston housing and stood, hands on hips, in his red silk boiler suit with gold trimming.
Where have you been, buddy?
I ran all the way, Rimmer panted. I can't have been more than 5 minutes.
You've been over a week.
Rimmer glanced at the clock. It was Saturday the 23rd. Crichton's head poked around the corner of the piston housing. We're ready and primed, he said. Let's start the engines. The three of them lumbered uneasily up the spiraled staircase and into the Navicomp suite. Crichton stabbed in the startup sequence and the massive piston smashed the engine to life. Crichton clapped his plastic hands in delight. We did it!
Okay.
The cat slid out of his silk boiler suit, revealing a quilted lame jumpsuit underneath.
Slip this baby into reverse and let's scoot.
Crichton typed in the appropriate sequence and the engine noise changed pitch, becoming a strangulated, thudding whine. 3 pairs of eyes fixed on the speed-bearing readout. It scarcely changed.
More power, said the cat. Get that pedal on the metal. Sluice that juice.
We're on full reverse thrust. The cat shouldered Crichton out the way and jabbed pointlessly at the controls.
It cannot be, novelty condom head. We're still moving forwards.
Look, Crichton pointed at the display. We're into the red. We're using all the power we've got. It's true then. Rimmer slumped into the console chair.
What's true?
What's true? Rimmer looked up, red-eyed with fear. Is that we're being sucked into a black hole.
Right.
Ooh.
Oh.
Sorry, I missed that.
But yeah.
Oh, again.
Oh, whoa.
I hope that was okay. But yeah, so that's it for that chapter. Oh, that's it for that part. The next one is Garbage World, which I'll read next Thursday around the same time. But I'm not going to leave without doing the ending theme. So and then I'll probably, let's see, who's streaming tonight. Gonna not leave it just yet, but oh, nobody actually. No, I'm not actually sure how many people are still in the stream, to be honest. But anyway, I don't know. Unless anyone else has any ideas of where we should send the stream. Hey, Isvar, does anyone else have any suggestions? Any people we could raid before I wrap up? Because in the meantime, I want to thank everyone for coming and listening and hanging out. It's been wonderful having you all here. I've had a very good time, and I love reading that part of the book. And now, we'll listen to the ending theme. So, if anyone wants to suggest anyone while the thing's going, then feel free. But otherwise, here we go. Bang. Okay, Myojin. Okay then. So, we'll read him. Them. Her. Them. So, thank you again, everyone. And have a good night. And I will see you all, hopefully next time. So, goodbye for now. Goodbye. Goodbye. Oh,